My older brother inherited our father's barbershop and banned our whole family from getting haircuts there. This is a professional establishment now. David's hand slammed against the glass door as I reached for the handle, the sound echoing through the empty shop like a gunshot. His wedding ring scraped against the window, leaving a mark that caught the morning light streaming through the blinds. Behind him, I could see Angelo DeMarco frozen in Dad's chair, electric clippers buzzing uselessly in David's other hand, half his haircut complete and the other half untouched. "You're done here, Tommy. Forever." David's voice carried the same tone he'd used when we were kids, and he'd caught me reading his comic books. Possessive, superior, final. "This is a professional establishment now. Your drug problem makes you unemployable, and frankly, dangerous to have around customers and equipment worth more than you'll make in 5 years." The shop looked wrong, sterile and cold like a medical facility, instead of the warm community gathering place Dad had spent 30 years building. The hand-painted sign reading Lombardi & Sons Barbershop had been scraped off the window and replaced with sleek vinyl lettering, Prestige Men's Grooming Studio. Even the smell was different. Dad's shop had smelled like aftershave, leather, and the faint sweetness of the pomade he'd used since the 1970s. Now it reeked of industrial disinfectant and the artificial vanilla scent David pumped through a wall-mounted air freshener. I stood there clutching my tool case, the same cracked leather bag Dad had given me for my 16th birthday, with my initials burned into the side by his own hand. Every scissor, every razor, every comb inside was perfectly maintained, sharpened weekly at Torino's Hardware, oiled daily with the same 3-in-1 lubricant Dad had sworn by since before I was born. These tools had taught me everything about the craft Dad called the sacred art of making men remember their dignity. Behind David, Angelo was staring at the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment at being trapped in the middle of our family drama. Angelo had been coming every Thursday at 2:30 for 23 years, always requesting the same cut Dad had perfected for his face shape and thinning hair. Now he looked like a prisoner of war, afraid to move or speak, while David held electric clippers that buzzed with expensive German precision, but none of Dad's gentle touch. "Please," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady despite the humiliation burning in my chest. "I've been clean for 2 years. I never stole from the business. I never missed work when Dad needed me. Every customer in this neighborhood knows me, trusts me. You can't just erase 15 years like they never happened." David's laugh was sharp and bitter, the sound of someone who'd been waiting years to have this conversation. 15 years of what? Showing up high, nodding off during appointments, stealing petty cash from the register whenever you thought nobody was looking? Dad covered for you because he was too soft-hearted to see what you really are. I don't have that problem. The accusation hit like a physical blow because it contained just enough truth to be believable to anyone who didn't know the whole story. Yes, I'd struggled with addiction. Yes, I'd made mistakes that had cost me jobs and relationships and my family's trust. But I'd never stolen from Dad, never endangered customers, never treated the barbershop as anything less than sacred ground where men came to be restored and respected. I walked home to my rented room above Castellano's pizza shop, past the vacant lot where neighborhood kids played stickball and old men gathered to argue about whether the Mets would ever recover from their latest heartbreak. Dad used to say this neighborhood was changing, but he'd meant gentrification and rising rents, not his own son turning the family business into something that excluded the very people who'd kept us alive through 3 decades of economic ups and downs. The smell of garlic and oregano drifted up from the kitchen below as I sat on my narrow bed, staring at the tool case that represented everything I'd lost. Mrs. Castellano was preparing for the dinner rush, the same ritual she'd performed 6 days a week for as long as I could remember. Consistency, tradition, service to the community, values Dad had taught me, and David had apparently forgotten in his rush toward professionalization. That night, I called every customer whose number I could remember from Dad's handwritten appointment book, the leather-bound ledger he'd maintained religiously since 1987. The conversations broke my heart one by one. Mr. O'Malley, who'd been getting the same straight razor shave since before I was born, told me David had refused to offer the service, claiming it was inefficient and legally risky in today's liability environment. Tony Ricci, whose father had brought him for his first haircut when he was 5, described being lectured about proper grooming maintenance schedules, while David charged $45 for a trim that used to cost $12. "Your brother spends more time looking at his phone than at my head," Tony said, frustration thick in his voice, "and he keeps talking about expanding into hair care products and scalp treatments like I'm some kind of business opportunity instead of a neighbor." Mrs. Patterson, who'd been bringing her grandson for monthly cuts since he was old enough to sit still in the chair, had perhaps the most damning assessment. "Your father knew how to make a child feel brave," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "David makes them feel like they're bothering him with their squirming. Little Michael cried the whole time during his last visit. I'm never taking him back there." Within a week, I was operating out of Rodriguez Auto Repair's parking lot, using a folding chair Miguel had pulled from his garage and an extension cord he'd let me run from his shop. $5 per cut, Same techniques Dad had taught me during those quiet morning sessions before the shop opened, when he'd show me the subtle differences between cutting hair for different face shapes and personality types. Word spread through the neighborhood's informal communication network faster than gossip at Sunday Mass. Miguel's customers started scheduling oil changes to coincide with haircuts. Construction workers from the site 3 blocks over began showing up during their lunch breaks. Even Father Hernandez from St. Michael's came by, claiming his regular barber had gotten too fancy for a simple priest's budget. The breakthrough came when Angelo DeMarco showed up during my second week, his hair still bearing the uneven marks of David's incomplete work. "I walked out in the middle of the cut," he explained, settling into the folding chair with obvious relief. "Your brother was too busy texting someone about inventory management to notice he'd left one side longer than the other." I fixed Angelo's haircut while he told me about the changes David had implemented since taking over. Appointment scheduling through a smartphone app that many older customers couldn't navigate. Credit card processing fees passed on to customers who'd been paying cash for decades. Most insulting, a consultation charge for customers who wanted to discuss anything beyond basic trim lengths. "Your father treated every man who walked through that door like he was worth something," Angelo said, as I blended the uneven sections with careful precision. "Rich or poor, young or old, everybody got the same attention, the same respect. David makes you feel like you're interrupting his important business to ask for basic courtesy." 2 months into my parking lot operation, David showed up during my busiest afternoon, stepping out of his new BMW like a politician visiting a disaster zone. His hair was perfectly styled, his shirt expensive enough to feed a family for a week, his shoes polished to the kind of gleam that screamed, "I don't do manual labor anymore." "This is embarrassing, Tommy," he said, loud enough for the waiting customers to hear every word. "You're making our whole family look like street vendors. Do you have any idea how this reflects on my business when potential clients see my brother operating a bootleg barbershop in a parking lot?" I was halfway through Mr. Castellano's weekly trim, taking my time with the delicate work around his ears that required absolute concentration. Dad had taught me never to rush, never let outside pressure affect the quality of service. Every customer deserved my complete attention for the time they spent in the chair. "I'm giving these people the same service Dad provided for 30 years, I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. Same techniques, same prices, same respect he showed every customer who trusted him with their appearance and their stories. David's face flushed red with anger or embarrassment, maybe both. Dad's prices didn't include insurance premiums, workers' compensation, business licensing fees, or any of the overhead that comes with running a legitimate establishment. "You're operating illegally, and I could have you shut down with one phone call to the city." Miguel emerged from his garage at that moment, wiping his hands on a rag that had absorbed 30 years' worth of automotive fluids and neighborhood gossip. He studied David's expensive clothes and aggressive posture, then looked at the line of customers waiting patiently under the October sun for their turn in my folding chair. "Your father cut my hair for 25 years, Miguel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd watched our family grow up in this neighborhood. "Never once charged me extra for taking time to ask about my kids, never made me feel like I couldn't afford to be there. Tommy's keeping that tradition alive while you're killing it in there." After David left, burning rubber as he peeled out of the parking lot in his BMW, something shifted in the community's perception of what I was doing. This wasn't just about cheap haircuts or family drama anymore. It was about preserving something valuable that was disappearing from neighborhoods across the country as small businesses got swallowed by chains and family traditions gave way to corporate efficiency. Father Hernandez became a regular customer and unofficial spokesperson, mentioning during Sunday sermons how the act of serving others with humility and skill was a form of worship that honored God and strengthened community bonds. His endorsement carried significant weight in a neighborhood where many families had attended St. Michael's for generations. 3 months after starting my parking lot operation, Mrs. Kim called me at 6 in the morning, her voice shaking with nervous energy or fear, maybe both. She'd been Dad's bookkeeper for 8 years, managing the shop's finances from her kitchen table while raising 3 children and caring for her elderly mother who spoke no English and trusted nobody outside the family. "Tommy, I need to tell you something about your father's will," she said, her words coming fast, like she was afraid she'd lose courage if she slowed down. "Something David doesn't know I witnessed, something that changes everything about who really owns the barbershop. We met at Mel's Diner on Maple Street, the same place Dad used to take me for pancakes after particularly difficult visits to cut hair for children in the cancer ward at St. Mary's Hospital." Mrs. Kim brought a manila folder thick with documents, her hands trembling as she spread papers across the sticky Formica table that had hosted 1,000 similar conversations about neighborhood business and family troubles. Father Hernandez sat beside me, not as a priest, but as someone who'd known Dad since they were altar boys together, and who understood the moral complexity of family inheritance disputes. His presence gave Mrs. Kim the courage to tell a story that had been eating at her conscience for months. "This is the original will I watched your father sign in my kitchen last February," she said, pointing to a document covered with Dad's careful handwriting in the margins. "He spent 3 hours explaining his reasoning to me, asking me to witness it because he trusted me to understand why he was making this decision. The will left the barbershop to both sons equally, with detailed instructions about how the business should operate to preserve its community function. Dad had written a separate letter explaining that addiction was a medical condition, not a moral failure, and that recovery required family support rather than permanent punishment. He believed Tommy's skills with customers and David's business education could combine to make the shop stronger than either brother could manage alone. Father Hernandez examined both documents with the careful attention of someone who'd mediated enough inheritance disputes to recognize fraud when he saw it. The signatures were different, subtle, but clear to someone looking carefully. More telling was the language used in the second will, formal legal terminology that sounded nothing like Dad's voice or values. "Mrs. Kim, you're alleging that David forged his father's final wishes?" Father Hernandez asked, his voice heavy with the implications of such an accusation within a close-knit community where reputation meant everything. Mrs. Kim nodded, producing photographs she'd taken secretly of David meeting with a lawyer named Brennan just 3 days after Dad's funeral. The images showed both men looking nervous and conspiratorial, speaking in whispers while examining documents that Mrs. Kim now recognized as the fraudulent will that had stolen my inheritance. The legal battle that followed consumed 10 months and nearly $40,000 in legal fees, money I raised by working 16-hour days and taking out loans against equipment I didn't own, an income I hadn't earned yet. David hired Kellerman and Associates, a prestigious firm that specialized in character assassination disguised as legal defense. They painted me as a drug-addicted criminal attempting to steal his brother's rightful inheritance through manipulation and false testimony. Patricia Kellerman, David's lead attorney, was a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s who'd built her career destroying the credibility of witnesses who threatened her clients' interests. She had former employers testifying about my unreliability, former neighbors describing property damage from my using days, former girlfriends recounting stories about money that had disappeared from their purses when I was desperate for drugs. Every mistake I'd made during my darkest years was dragged into court and examined under harsh courtroom lights. The testimony was brutal and public and designed to make me give up rather than continue fighting. Kellerman brought up the time I'd been arrested for shoplifting cold medicine to make methamphetamine, the night I'd been found unconscious in the parking lot behind St. Michael's, the intervention my family had staged when I'd missed Mom's birthday because I was too high to remember what day it was. But Mrs. Kim had been documenting everything with the meticulous attention of someone who'd fled communist Vietnam by learning to recognize patterns that others missed. She had bank records showing suspicious payments from David to Brennan's law firm just days after Dad's death. She had recordings of phone conversations between David and Brennan discussing document modifications and beneficiary adjustments. Most damning was a recording she'd made of David and Brennan meeting in her kitchen, assuming her limited English meant she wouldn't understand their discussion about backdating signatures and destroying original documents. Her English was actually perfect, refined through years of night school and community college courses she'd taken while working 2 jobs to support her family. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source that nobody could have predicted. David's girlfriend, Jessica Moreau, contacted my lawyer with information she could no longer keep secret without betraying everything she believed about right and wrong. Jessica had been a hospice nurse for 12 years, trained to recognize the signs of prescription drug addiction in patients and their families. She'd watched David's behavior change dramatically after Dad's death, noticing symptoms that were textbook indicators of opioid dependency disguised as grief and stress. "He was stealing your mother's pain medication during her final weeks," Jessica testified, her voice breaking with the weight of secrets she'd kept out of misguided loyalty. "He convinced himself he was helping her avoid becoming dependent, but really, he was feeding his own addiction that had been growing since his back surgery 2 years earlier." The evidence Jessica provided was overwhelming and impossible to explain away. Medical records showing David had obtained prescriptions from 3 different doctors for the same fabricated injuries, pharmacy records documenting suspicious patterns of early refills and doctor shopping, even security camera footage from the CVS on Hamilton Avenue showing David using fake identification to pick up prescriptions under his dead mother's name. Dr. Patricia Okafor, David's primary physician, took the stand with obvious reluctance and professional embarrassment. She described a pattern of behavior that had raised red flags, but that she'd initially attributed to legitimate pain from old sports injuries and work-related stress. Mr. Lombardi became increasingly agitated when I suggested alternatives to opioid pain management, she testified. When I tried to refer him to a pain specialist, he became verbally abusive and threatened to file a malpractice lawsuit if I didn't continue prescribing OxyContin at the dosages he demanded. The courtroom revelation that hit hardest came from customer testimony about David's deteriorating performance at the barbershop. Angelo DeMarco, despite his loyalty to our family, described incidents where David had been unable to hold scissors steady, his hands shaking so badly that customers left with unfinished haircuts and nick marks from slipping blades. Mrs. Patterson testified about David falling asleep during her grandson's appointment, the electric clippers slipping and cutting a bald patch that took 6 months to grow back and traumatized a 7-year-old who'd been excited about his first big boy haircut. He was high during my son's wedding preparation, Tony Ricci said, his voice thick with anger that had been building for months. The most important haircut of the kid's life, and David could barely stand up straight. We had to go to a salon in the mall to fix the damage, and my son looked like an idiot in all his wedding photos. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate David's mental state, explained how prescription opioid addiction often manifested in high-functioning individuals as increasing desperation to maintain their public image while feeding their dependency through any means necessary. The defendant's decision to forge his father's will was likely driven by two factors, she testified. First, his need to secure financial resources for continued drug purchases as his tolerance increased and his prescriptions became harder to obtain legally. Second, impaired judgment caused by chronic substance abuse that affected his ability to consider long-term consequences of his actions. The financial records Mrs. Kim had maintained painted a devastating picture of systematic theft disguised as business expenses. David had been withdrawing cash daily, claiming equipment purchases that never materialized, supplier payments for inventory that was never delivered, professional development courses he'd never attended. In 18 months of managing the barbershop, he'd drained nearly $60,000 from accounts Dad had built over 30 years of careful saving and reinvestment, money that was supposed to fund equipment maintenance, insurance payments, and the emergency reserves Dad had accumulated to weather economic downturns. David's testimony on his own behalf was painful to watch and impossible to believe. Withdrawal symptoms made his hands shake visibly and his voice crack as he tried to explain away documented evidence of fraud and addiction. He admitted to taking Mom's medication, but claimed it was for legitimate back pain that doctors had failed to diagnose properly. He acknowledged discrepancies in the will, but insisted Dad had changed his mind about leaving me anything because of my history with drug abuse and unreliability. When asked to explain the suspicious timing of payments to Brennan's law firm, he claimed they were for estate planning advice that any responsible businessman would seek. Under cross-examination by my lawyer, Sofia Vargas, a young Puerto Rican woman who'd grown up 6 blocks from the barbershop and understood the neighborhood's values and relationships, David's story fell apart completely. She methodically exposed every lie, every contradiction, every moment where his version of events couldn't be reconciled with documented facts. When she asked him to demonstrate basic barbering techniques using the tools Dad had taught both of us, his hands shook so badly he couldn't complete simple scissor cuts. The demonstration was devastating, showing clearly that drug abuse had destroyed his ability to perform the craft that was supposed to be his birthright and profession. Judge Harold Brennan, no relation to David's corrupt lawyer, had presided over family court for 24 years and had seen every variation of sibling rivalry, inheritance disputes, and family businesses torn apart by greed and addiction. But this case seemed to affect him personally, perhaps because his own father had been a barber in South Boston who'd struggled to pass his trade to children who'd chosen different paths. This case represents far more than a dispute over property or financial assets, Judge Brennan said, as he prepared to deliver his verdict after 4 days of testimony and 2 days of deliberation. It's about the sacred responsibility we have to preserve family legacies and honor the sacrifices of those who built something meaningful with their hands and hearts. The judge's voice carried genuine emotion as he continued. The evidence shows clearly and convincingly that the defendant systematically defrauded his brother, betrayed his customers' trust, and dishonored the memory of a father who spent 30 years building something valuable for his community and his family. Judge Brennan awarded me full ownership of the barbershop, plus damages for lost income, legal expenses, and the cost of restoring the business to its original condition and community function. David was sentenced to 18 months probation, mandatory addiction treatment, and 500 hours of community service at facilities serving homeless and indigent populations. Perhaps by serving others who have less than he does, the judge said, the defendant will rediscover the values his father tried to teach him about the dignity of honest work and service to community. But the legal victory felt hollow and incomplete. As I stood in the doorway of the barbershop, David had transformed into something I barely recognized. The warm wood paneling Dad had installed with his own hands was covered with cheap plastic laminate. The vintage chairs he'd restored lovingly over decades were gone, sold to an antique dealer for a fraction of their value to fund David's drug purchases and lifestyle upgrades. Most heartbreaking was the wall where Dad had displayed photos of customers' weddings, graduations, military service, and family milestones. 3 decades of community memory replaced with generic stock photos of male models with perfect hair and empty eyes, images chosen by a designer who'd never met a single person who'd sat in these chairs. Restoring the shop took 4 months and consumed most of my damage award, plus loans from 3 different sources. I found one of Dad's original chairs at an estate sale in Queens, paying premium prices to outbid collectors who wanted it for decoration rather than daily use. The second chair took longer to locate, finally tracked down through a network of barbers who understood the historical and emotional value of authentic equipment. The vintage barber poles were scattered across flea markets and antique shops from Connecticut to Pennsylvania, each one requiring negotiation with dealers who knew exactly what they were worth to someone desperate to reclaim family history. Every piece I recovered felt like rescuing a relative from exile, bringing home artifacts that carried the weight of countless conversations and connections. Mrs. Patterson was my first customer when I reopened in March, arriving at 7 in the morning with tears streaming down her face and a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies still warm from her oven. "It smells like your father's shop again," she said, settling into the chair she'd occupied every month for 27 years. David had it smelling like a hospital, all disinfectant and fear. Angelo DeMarco came next, bringing his teenage son Vincent for what would be the boy's first professional haircut in the restored shop. "I've been waiting 8 months for this moment," Angelo said, running his hand along the familiar leather armrest that had been worn smooth by decades of customers' nervous gripping. The neighborhood response exceeded my wildest expectations. Customers I hadn't seen since David took over returned with stories about their experiences at chain salons and mall barbershops, places where they'd felt rushed, unwelcome, or simply forgotten as individuals with histories and preferences and stories worth hearing. They'd missed the conversation that flowed naturally while I worked, the sense of community that emerged when men from different backgrounds found themselves sharing space and discovering common ground. They'd missed feeling valued for who they were, rather than judged for what they could afford, or how they measured against some corporate standard of the ideal customer. But I knew the shop needed something beyond nostalgia and tradition to survive in a neighborhood that was changing faster than ever. Young families were being priced out by rising rents, while new developments brought residents who had different expectations and cultural references. The inspiration came from Father Hernandez during one of our regular conversations about community needs and social justice. "The men in this neighborhood are struggling with challenges your father's generation never faced," he said one evening as I finished his monthly trim. "Unemployment that lasts years instead of months, prescription drug addiction, young veterans returning from multiple deployments with invisible wounds. I started offering free haircuts on Sunday mornings for anyone who couldn't afford regular services. Veterans dealing with PTSD and unemployment, homeless individuals trying to maintain dignity while living in shelters, people in recovery programs who needed to look presentable for job interviews or court appearances. Word spread through social services networks and veterans organizations faster than I could handle. Soon, I had a steady stream of customers who needed more than just grooming services. They needed someone to listen without judgment, someone who understood that looking good could be the first step toward feeling human again. Father Hernandez suggested converting the shop's storage room into a meeting space where men could gather for informal support groups. We installed folding chairs and a coffee maker, creating an environment where veterans could talk about nightmares, recovering addicts could share strategies for staying clean, and unemployed workers could network about job opportunities. The combination proved powerful beyond anything I'd anticipated. Men who came for free haircuts stayed for conversations that addressed deeper needs. Veterans found other veterans who understood experiences that couldn't be shared with civilians. Recovering addicts connected with mentors who'd successfully rebuilt their lives after losing everything to drugs or alcohol. David completed his court-mandated treatment at a residential facility in upstate New York, sending me letters that chronicled his journey toward sobriety and self-awareness with brutal honesty. The early letters were full of anger and blame, insisting that his addiction was somehow my fault for making him feel inadequate and forcing him to live up to impossible standards. But gradually, as he worked through the program's 12 steps, his tone changed dramatically. He began acknowledging the pain he'd caused, not just to me but to customers, to Jessica, to the memory of our parents who'd sacrificed everything to build something meaningful for their children and community. "I convinced myself I was protecting Dad's legacy by keeping you away from the shop," he wrote in careful, childish handwriting that reminded me of homework assignments from 30 years ago. "The truth is, I was destroying everything he built because I was too proud to admit I needed help and too afraid to let anyone see how broken I was inside." Jessica visited me 6 months into David's treatment, bringing a photo album that documented the progression of his addiction with clinical precision and heartbreaking detail. The images showed a man disappearing into his disease, while everyone who loved him looked away or made excuses rather than confronting the obvious truth. "I enabled him by keeping quiet," she admitted, tears streaming down her face as we sat in Dad's restored chair. "I told myself I was protecting his privacy, but I was really protecting my own image as the girlfriend of a successful businessman. I should have forced him into treatment before he had the chance to hurt you and all those customers." The corrupt lawyer, Brennan, faced disbarment proceedings that exposed a broader pattern of elder fraud throughout the county. My case had been one of 23 similar situations where he'd helped families manipulate inheritance documents, always targeting the most vulnerable family members with histories of mental illness, addiction, or financial problems. District Attorney Michelle Rodriguez charged Brennan with conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and professional misconduct. His conviction resulted in a 7-year prison sentence and prompted new oversight procedures for probate court proceedings throughout the state. This case became a model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar inheritance fraud schemes, Rodriguez told reporters after the sentencing. It showed how unscrupulous lawyers could exploit family dysfunction and addiction to steal from vulnerable individuals who trusted the legal system to protect them. A year after reopening, the shop was featured in a newspaper article about local businesses that were preserving community character in the face of rapid gentrification. The reporter, Carmen Delgado, spent an entire morning observing the natural interactions between customers and documenting the stories that emerged organically from conversations in the chairs. Lombardi's represents something increasingly rare in modern America, she wrote. A business that measures success not in quarterly profit reports, but in community impact, where a construction worker can sit next to a college professor, where a Vietnam veteran can mentor a teenager about responsibility, and where a recovering addict can help someone else navigate their first fragile weeks of sobriety. The article brought customers from across the metropolitan area, people willing to travel significant distances for an authentic barbershop experience that prioritized relationships over efficiency. But it also attracted attention from developers who saw the shop's success as evidence that the neighborhood was ready for upscale commercial investment opportunities. 4 different real estate companies approached me with offers to purchase the building, each emphasizing how much money I could make by relocating to a more suitable location that would accommodate my quaint business model without interfering with their development plans. The offers started at $300,000 and climbed to nearly $600,000 as they realized I wasn't motivated by financial gain alone. The final offer included a relocation package that would have set me up in a strip mall location with twice the square footage and modern amenities. This building represents 30 years of relationships and community trust, I told the last developer, a smooth-talking man in a $1,000 suit who kept checking his smartphone during our conversation. You can't relocate the stories these walls have absorbed or pack up the healing that happens in these chairs. David completed his treatment program and moved to Phoenix with Jessica, who'd found work as a director of nursing at a hospice facility that specialized in treating addiction among healthcare workers. His letters from Arizona described a different kind of life, working at a community barbershop in a low-income neighborhood where most customers paid what they could afford rather than what services cost. I'm starting over at 45 years old, he wrote in his most recent letter, which arrived on the 2nd anniversary of Dad's death. I make $9 an hour plus tips, and I'm learning to cut hair the way you and Dad always did it, with patience and attention to each person's individual dignity and needs. He included photos of himself working with clients who reminded me of our old neighborhood customers, elderly men on fixed incomes, young fathers trying to look presentable for job interviews, teenagers getting their first professional haircuts before school dances or graduation ceremonies. For the first time since Dad died, I feel like I'm honoring his memory instead of destroying it, David wrote. I'm never going to own my own shop again, and that's probably for the best. I'm better suited to being someone who serves others than someone who manages a business. The shop's support group meetings had grown to include more than 30 regular participants, men dealing with everything from combat trauma to unemployment to family breakdown. The diversity was remarkable. Veterans from Vietnam and Afghanistan, construction workers laid off by economic changes, fathers struggling with custody battles, young men aging out of foster care with no family support systems. Father Hernandez attended regularly, not as a counselor, but as someone who understood the healing power of honest conversation in environments where men felt safe to be vulnerable. This is what church was supposed to be, he said one evening after a particularly powerful session where 3 different men had shared stories about overcoming suicidal thoughts. We expanded to include women's hours on Monday evenings after several wives and daughters asked if they could experience the same sense of community their husbands and fathers were finding. Maria Santos, a licensed cosmetologist who'd been unemployed since her salon closed during the recession, volunteered to handle the technical work while I focused on creating the same atmosphere of acceptance and genuine care. The women's group attracted teachers, nurses, social workers, and mothers who needed space to process the challenges of caring for everyone else while neglecting their own needs. The conversations were different from the men's sessions but equally powerful, creating bonds that extended beyond monthly appointments to mutual support during crises and celebrations. On the 3rd anniversary of Dad's death, I organized a block party in the parking lot behind Rodriguez Auto Repair, the same space where I'd started my comeback with a folding chair and determination to preserve something valuable. Current customers brought their families while former customers returned to celebrate the shop's resurrection and community impact. Angelo DeMarco stood up during the informal speeches, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd of nearly 200 people. Tommy's father used to say that a good barber doesn't just cut hair, he helps people remember who they are underneath all the things life piles on top of them. This shop, this community, it's living proof that some things matter more than profit margins. Mrs. Patterson presented me with a scrapbook she'd been assembling for months, filled with photos from 3 decades of neighborhood events, family celebrations, and quiet moments of human connection that had happened in Dad's chairs. The final page contained a letter Dad had written during my first serious attempt at recovery, when I was still too proud and too scared to accept help from anyone. Son, the letter read in Dad's careful handwriting, addiction is not a moral failing or a character defect. It's a medical condition that requires treatment, support, and infinite patience from people who love you. The man you become in recovery will be stronger and more compassionate than the boy who never fell down, because you'll understand suffering in a way that makes you capable of helping others heal. The barbershop will be here waiting when you're ready to carry on what we started together. Reading those words aloud to the gathered crowd, I finally understood that Dad had always known I would inherit the shop, not through legal documents or family politics, but through the painful process of becoming someone worthy of the responsibility. David had inherited the business, but I had inherited the calling. The party continued until nearly midnight, with people sharing food and stories and connections that would last long after the folding tables were put away. Veterans swapped contact information with job recruiters. Recovering addicts exchanged phone numbers with sponsors and accountability partners. Children who'd been scared of their first haircuts were making plans to return for their next visits. As the last guests headed home, carrying leftover food and promises to stay in touch, I stood in the doorway of the restored shop and thought about all the lives that had been changed by this simple commitment to serving others with dignity and respect. Dad's legacy hadn't just survived David's attempts to destroy it. It had grown stronger and more meaningful than either of us had ever imagined possible. The shop remains open 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, continuing to serve as both barbershop and community center. Carlos, the young veteran I'd met during my first month back, now owns his own landscaping business and brings his son for monthly haircuts that include lessons about responsibility, service, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. David writes occasionally, sober now for over 2 years, and slowly rebuilding relationships with customers who remember him from before addiction changed who he was. We exchange holiday cards and photos, maintaining the connection that survived our worst moments and might someday grow back into something resembling brotherhood.